From the kitchen of the cabin and around the world, this is Voices from the Solitude, a podcast about the coronavirus, the aftermath, and gaming. In this episode, I talk to Tony Boydell about the Museum of Board Games. So I'm privileged and happy to talk about a story that came out of COVID that is, how should I put this, emboldening and interesting, and tells you what you can do if you have an obsessive need to trawl through eBay non-stop. I'm here with game designer, game publisher, all-round bon vivant, and now museum curator, Tony Boydell. Tony, welcome to the show.
Good morning to you, Ben. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Autumn is creeping in, and with that I feel old. So, the reason I have Tony on the line is because he has recently started a new venture, which is the Museum of Board Games in the gloriously cosmopolitan New Ent of Gloucestershire. So yesterday was the opening day. So what was the preparations needed for that sort of grand opening yesterday?
Well, the main business was to, obviously with this idea, was to find an actual venue that would be suitable for something. And I've always been a realist about these things. And so, there were a couple of properties that came up with, multiple rooms on multiple floors. And you think, oh, that would be fantastic. I could have a room for this and a room for Steffenfeld, and I could have an Uwe Rosenberg shrine room and all that kind of stuff. And then realism kicks in and say, well, no, come on. You've got a bunch of games that are filling up your house. You need them out of the house, otherwise Mrs. B is going to divorce you. So what you've got to do is find somewhere that's not a storage unit in an industrial estate in Gloucester to put these things. And the best place would be a nice, reasonably sized property, hopefully just down the road. And so in all seriousness, I was looking for a small shop property. And the best place to have a small shop is in a small town, because all the properties are small. Now, Newent itself had a little museum about 40 years ago, when it was opened there, which was a series of outbuildings containing vintage shop materials, shop goods. So there would be a pretend apothecary with all the old Beecham's powders boxes and Colgate toothpaste stuff, and a vintage garage with oiled oil cans and signs for Castor or whatever it was. And you'd go in and you'd go and walk around these little outbuildings. Each outbuilding would have its own little theme. And when the guy that ran that died, they didn't want to carry on. The family didn't want to carry on. So they opened up all the little units that were previously exhibits, effectively, into separate shoplets for small local businesses. So you've got crafts people, you've got a tattooist, there's a little art gallery there. And the property I've taken on is in the middle of the courtyard bit, and it used to be a vape shop. But unfortunately, in the irony that is COVID, it's many things, but also the guy that ran the vape shop has respiratory difficulties, so he couldn't stay open during COVID, because if he caught COVID, he'd die. So he couldn't carry on with that. So it was perfect. It's one relatively large room with a little triangular out room with a big bay window in it, and a nice deep display window. Everything about it is absolutely right for a venture like this. It's small, it's affordable, it's central to the town. So that's the first thing I had to do, was find somewhere to actually put all of this stuff. The next thing, of course, is the boring businessy stuff. So I had to talk with the council about rates, because obviously you don't want to pay rates. I'm not going to earn enough to pay rates on anything. So we had to sort that out. Insurances, all the boring stuff, a bank account, all that kind of thing. And then you get to the interesting bits, which is actually making the thing look like a museum. And there, my dear friend, IKEA is the most wonderful thing on the planet. Right. IKEA is your one-stop shop for deep shelving at an affordable price, and cabinets with glass fronts and shelves at an affordable price, lights, all sorts of stuff. IKEA is absolutely your best mate. And so Mrs. B and I made several trips, and actually had a couple of deliveries as well of these items. And so this sort of thing grows and grows, and then you're dabbing up the walls a bit, retouching up bits of plaster. And even then, there's still that's a lot of work to get it to that sort of empty shell with placeholders in it, then you've got to start thinking about, well, where does everything go? And that's when the fun started. And I spent the last week leading up to the opening yesterday, because today is the Sunday, obviously 29th of August, literally just noodling around every afternoon and evening, just moving things about, arranging old and dusty things in the cabinets to protect them, putting little Easter eggs around the place, little quest items, stacking and packing things, lots and lots of that kind of sorting. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time taking old boards that came separately from the board components and wrapping them with a thick cardboard backing in sort of a film, thick plastic film, so you can handle them and you can look at them as a visitor. So, when you go to a picture gallery, they often sell you prints and they're all cellophane wrapped and they're in those little sort of racks. You can sort of scroll through them and have a look. Well, that's what I've done with the book game boards. So you can actually pick them up and have a look and say, oh, look at the detail on this Dennis Wheatley Alibi board, or look at the beautiful pictures on the Prince's Quest board. It also doubles as a great way of, if I want to let people play those games in the future, I can just put the board protected flat on the gaming table in the middle of the shop. And, they can play it without actually having to sort of handle the actual board itself. So it reduces the damage and makes it more accessible. So, yeah, I mean, that's the extent to the preparation, is the boring businessy bit. The time-consuming and sweaty construction of the infrastructure. And then there's the fun bit, which is also a little bit of an angsty bit, which is where you're trying to put everything in the right place. And fundamentally, the mantra I had in my head as I was getting towards the end of last week, or this week just gone, was don't worry about it being 100% perfect on day one. Don't worry that not everything is in exactly the right place that it should be, because you'll just fettle and fiddle with it over the next few months. It's what we did. I kept forgetting that I used to do this at Essen and UK Games Expo with our stands. You'd unload all of the stuff, you'd put it all out for display, and then you'd spend the next 2 or 3 days just moving stuff about into better places, better positions, make it more visible, make things more accessible. So that's what I'm going to be doing with the museum. And I'll be just doing it with dusty things, old things, new things, plastic things, cardboard things, whatever it might be.
So yesterday you had your opening and you said it was quiet because, I mean, the thing is, right, it's so firstly, how was the opening? And secondly, tell us about Newent, the town, so we kind of understand the context in which the museum's set.
Yeah, I'll give you the context. So Newent is a small rural town in the Forest of Dean. So the Forest of Dean is a very famous industrial area, but now it's got a lot of tourist things in it. It's got a little miniature railway. It has Puzzle Wood, which is where they filmed Star Wars and Doctor Who and all sorts of other stuff. It's got lots and lots of beautiful forest, walking, cycling, picturesque stuff. It really is a gorgeous part of the country. So Newent is sort of on the edge of that part of the Forest of Dean. It's a sleepy little town. We're very well behaved. During COVID times, people have been very good about wearing masks. They still wear masks around the town. It's very quiet, partly because a number of the major roads have been closed off because generally speaking, people aren't really going anywhere. If the people are going on holiday, they're doing a staycation. So they're either staying at home or they're going somewhere close to home. But I say Herefordshire, in particular in the Forest of Dean, people have been very well behaved about not flooding everything. I mean, I think there was an episode during the Euro 2020 final where a couple of pubs in Newent got rather crowded and then somebody gave everyone else COVID. And that sort of shut everything down again, and people sort of realised, hang on a sec, it doesn't take much before, we could all be suffering again. So you just don't see people about. I mean, the weather yesterday, and in fact this morning, is absolutely gorgeous. A lovely late summer's day. So it's bright and warm, but not too hot. But the people just aren't out and about. There's not much happening. But from the point of view of my museum, having spent now 2 months getting everything ready, all the planning and preparation, there's no point in sort of saying, well, I'll wait till it's a busier weekend. This is the last good weather potential bank holiday in the UK this year. And people will either come out or they won't. but I've got to be there, and I've got to start getting the name of the museum out. So I've had a lot of goodwill from the local social media platforms. People are sort of, well, I'm not around this weekend, but I'd love to come and see it. I'm looking forward to coming along. I want to start a board games club in the evening, just to help locally. Because I know there's a lot of people who play games locally, but they're not willing, for instance, to go into Gloucester or to Ross and Y,
right,
or towns like that to play. And in fact, the Ross and Y club isn't playing in the pub because the pub isn't open yet. Even after all of this time, even though many pubs in the UK are open for business now, quite happily, the one that we called our home in Ross and Y, the Plough Inn, still isn't open for business, and probably won't be this year, I don't think. I mean, why would they open now when the good weather's going away again? And we'd all have to have all the doors closed, So the Ross Club tends to meet in people's homes. And that means it's quite hard for some people to go to those homes because it's a bit far out. Ross was a sort of equidistant central point, whereas now we're going to the fringes. So I'm trying to do things quietly. I'm not paying my mortgage with this. I'm looking to try and get this thing built up slowly. The only real way to get it going in the county is just word of mouth. And that means talking to local newspapers. And again, there's no point in talking to local newspapers when the building has still got wet paint on it and the stuff isn't sorted out. You kind of want things running, and me to kind of now have an understanding of what I should do before you invite the media in. It needs to be as sort of slick as possible. I mean, for instance, yesterday, I had some good friends pop in. A couple of strangers popped in, which is lovely. I had one guy scurry away quite quickly when he realised he'd have to pay a couple of quid just to look around, which is always funny. I understand. Don't be embarrassed, mate. It's fine. Well, the thing is, it's difficult to tell people that you could stay and look in this museum. You could look around, and it would take you an hour to have a reasonable look at everything that's in there. And if you wanted to stay and play one of the games of the day, which yesterday I was doing a series of board games based on video games from the early 1980s, you could spend a couple of hours quite happily there. But it's difficult to tell people that because they come in and they see all these cabinets and racks full of stuff, and they kind of don't know where to start and don't know what to ask. So again, I'm learning about how to get people started. So go to that corner and start reading the little placards I've put in the cabinet and ask me questions and tell me about games that you played when you were young that you might see here, or that I might be interested in finding, because, the museum is always interested in looking for new things. And yesterday, in fact, I spent the quiet time putting together a list of 50 questions, just to help people see every part of the museum. And again, I got a feeling that if you really seriously wanted to process those 50 questions, it's going to take you a couple of hours, because it takes you all around the museum. And some of the questions are really obvious, and some of them are quite subtle. So, some will refer to a particular part of one of the posters, or one will refer to something that's on a particular game board, or there'll be a pig hiding in one of the cabinets and you've got to find it. There's lots of things like that. I'm trying to instill a feeling of involvement to help you stay focused as you visit the exhibits within the museum.
So let's go back to the beginning then. So anyone who reads your blog, Every Man Needs a Shed, will know that you developed this sort of obsessive desire to collect old, interesting board games from sort of Victoriana up until sort of reasonably recent. So, yeah, how did that start? Was it started with the idea of starting a museum, or was it just that you wished to look at the history of the hobby?
It started, actually, I think it was about Essen 2009 or 2010. And there were a couple of old gentlemen. I say old, I mean, then they were in their mid-60s, I think. Went by the name of Glenwood Games, and they're based in Yorkshire. And I fear that they may have passed on now, because they were a little bit doddery then. But they had brought over from the UK a whole bunch of vintage games. And they were selling them. And now, of course, at Essen, that layout at Essen, there's all the new games, the new games halls. There's also the second-hand dealers, and they are wonderful places to get some of those Spiel des Jahres from the 90s and early noughties. Lots of lovely games you can get from the second hand. But these guys had all this beautiful vintage stuff. And they had things like the Z Cars, which is a British TV series from the 1960s. They had the board game for that with these lovely little tin police cars. And they had what was to be my first vintage purchase. And it was an historical game of George III, a linen printed board in a spiral that went from 1066 on the first disc, and it spiraled into the center with a picture of George III. So it was the history of England from 1066 all the way to George III, 1800 or so. And this was produced by Wallace in 1802. And yes, for those of you that know the wonderful Mr. James Wallace, they are part of his ancestry. He is involved in that family somewhere. So it is appropriate that someone like James, who is big in games generally, is also, has that lineage. But that was my first thing, and I had it framed, and it's been on my wall for years. And it is a sumptuously illustrated, wonderful thing. And over the years, I've collected old things from the 40s and 50s, party games, parlor games, from companies like Peeps, PGP, and Universal Publications Limited. And as I've seen these things, I'm more and more intrigued. And as I've become sort of more disinterested in the cult of the new, I've switched my focus, because I can't not think about games. I always have to think about games. My focus switched to older games. And then, as lockdown bit, I started looking at eBay thinking, well, look, there's a copy of the Z-Cars game that I saw Glenwood Games selling in Essen in 2010. I could get a copy of that, 15 quid. Brilliant. Oh, look, there's Frogger from 1980. That's cool. Oh, look, there's also Pac-Man. Oh, great. If I could get the set of the MB Games video games. And then that became naturally this idea of producing the museum.
And so, I mean, how long did it take you from that first sort of... Well, I guess you started in 2008, but when did you really think, okay, I'm going to do this museum and it's going to be... I'm going to actually do it rather than it just be a sort of fancy?
Well, when I looked at the spare room, and there was the spare room has got a very tall ceiling. It's part of the new bit of the house when we built that bit. And it goes almost 2 stories high, this hugely tall room. And there are Ivar shelves completely stacked full of stuff. I thought, well, I can't fill any more games in this room. I need them to be somewhere else. And that was sort of around the end of last year, beginning of this year. I decided I need to start thinking about where can I put these. I either need to put them into storage or I need to put them into museum. And then I started looking around Newent at the closed shops, the shoplets in the Shambles unit, which is where it is now. And decided, right, well, I really need to find out how much these things cost, and what scope I've got for actually taking this thing forward. And then around about July was when this unit sort of officially came available. And I said, right, well, look, I've got to try it. If it doesn't work, if I try it for 12 months and it doesn't work, fine. I'll sell off all the stuff I don't want. I'll keep all the stuff I do want. And then I'll just chalk it down to experience. But like many things, if you don't try it, you never know. I mean, I think I remember talking about starting Surprise Dare Games with Alan Paul back in 99. We were sort of wondering whether we should or could do it. And then we both sort of decided, well, why not? Just try it. If it doesn't work, no one's going to make you carry on with the business if you don't want to do it or you can't do it. Just do it. And it'll either work or it won't. And it's that no regrets thing, isn't it? Is it don't look back on your life and go, God, I wonder what if,
And sort of what is the ethos of the museum? What is sort of, when you go in, is it categorized chronologically? Is it categorized thematically? When you walk through the door, what kind of hook sort of picks you into going round?
There are sort of 2 areas really. There are the display only bits, which are the cabinets, and then above them there's a deep window sort of shelf above that on the Ivar shelving, where the items are really just for look, don't touch. And then I've put, for the moment, I have a whole set of placards against the appropriate items and things I want to talk about, and they're sort of loosely ordered. Although, I mean, there's a sort of war games theme to one bit of cabinets. There's a sporty, football-y, racing theme to another cabinet. And then there's a horse. There's definitely, I've got enough stuff for horse and greyhound racing to have a cabinet of its own. And then, generally speaking, above them, there are shelves where things are stored flat, but you can see what they are. And those things, and they are also in the little triangular bit off the side of the main room, those are games that I'm generally going to make available for play, either in the evening clubs or during theme weeks. So, for instance, I've got 6 or 7 games to do with these video games. And so they're out on the gaming tables in the middle of the museum. And the idea is you can look at them and go, oh, that's funny, that's great. Isn't it ironic how, then it was board games that were important and video games were sort of leeching off the popularity of board games, and how it's turned around. Video games are everything in the big market, and board games tend to be the spin-off, So, but if you want a game of Donkey Kong, as somebody did yesterday, well, we can just take it out of the packet. I'm not precious about it. These things cost 15, 20 quid each off eBay. What's the point of having a museum of board games if you can't actually play a bloody board game? So 2/3 of the stuff that's in there is available to be played at some point, including I've got a whole bunch of children's games, which I'm literally going to be leaving out. And hopefully next weekend, when there's a sort of open day in Newent, they're trying to get people out to a little bit of a bijou street fair. I'm hoping that we can get families playing games out in the courtyard at the tables. Playing bingo and some of these little disc throwing games, these little dexterity games and so on. Because, as I say, what's the point in having a museum of board games if you can't actually play the bloody things?
And so, can you give us some of the interesting things you've picked up over the years? Some of the really quirky, odd games that we can find if we go to the museum?
Well, my favourite genre are the Tiddlywinks games, because most people think of Tiddlywinks, you just sort of flicking one disc with another disc and you're trying to get it into a central pot. But Tiddlywinks, which is a 19th century game, we're talking sort of 1880s, 1890s as the first appearance of Tiddlywinks, tremendously popular. And so there's a lot of games that use Tiddlywinks as a central mechanism. So I've got Tiddly Golf with these lovely little tin cups with flags welded onto them, and you lay them around the table and you're literally trying to squidge the wink into the appropriate pot in the right sequence. I've got Tiddly Tennis, which is something we played yesterday in the shop, although the rules for it are quite punishing. They're quite with the Tiddly Tennis rules as they currently stand, this is a 1930s 1940s game, you end up basically getting penalised for missing, either hitting the net or going out of bounds, by giving points to your opponent rather than scoring lots of points for yourself. So for those of us who are used to modern games, we tend to sort of take our turn and score 5 points for ourselves and 60 points for our opponents. But then 100 years ago, when everybody played Tiddlywinks, you can imagine that grandfather was an absolute demon at Tiddlywinks, So games like that would have been much more skillful and maybe not quite so, punishing as they are for modern day sensibilities. So I changed the rules slightly to make it a little bit friendlier. Tiddly, what else we've got there? Sea Winks, which is in one of my posh display cabinets, is battleships, but with Tiddlywinks. So instead of calling out A9, you're literally firing these Tiddlywinks across a linen map board and trying to hit little standees of your opponent's boats. And if your destroyer takes 3 damage, then it's sunk. And then depending on what ship you're firing, it can fire maybe 1, 2 or 3 shots. So there's actually quite a lot of lovely sort of modern day feel mechanisms and sort of leveling elements that you might have in a family game nowadays, already incorporated into something that most people would turn their noses up at nowadays. So those those Tiddlywink games are a particular favourite of mine at the moment.
And so let's get to the crux of it then. So you've started this museum, and it's a work in progress, and it will shift, and its focus will change over time. And this isn't something that is free, and I assume you don't charge much to get in, but also you have a Patreon. So tell us about sort of how much it costs to get into the museum, and then tell us about the Patreon and what people can get if they back it.
Well, the normal entrance fee is, I mean, it's a couple of quid for an adult, and it's £1 for a child, and there's a little deal for, you know, your usual nuclear family, 2 adults, 2 children. So it's a very small charge, because I want to get people in. I don't want to overcharge. It's not an amusement park. You're not going to spend the entire day there. Somebody who's very interested in board games can quite happily spend a couple of hours, easily 2 or 3 hours there, just methodically going through everything. But most people will come in, they'll point at a couple of things, you know, they'll have a game of something, and they'll probably be gone within the hour. So that pricing is really just to be friendly, and you know, people understand that these things aren't free. It costs to rent a building, and it costs to heat it and to light it. So, you know, that's the sort of basics. It's a very small charge. And I have a little tiny gift shop, which I'll be growing with items as we go through. From the Patreon perspective, that's more about gathering the folks that are really interested in this project and would like to support it in some way. And that's people that are in the UK that would like to be more involved, and obviously international visitors who may get to visit at some point, but may not, but would just like to help out. And those things, as you know, as lots of people who provide game-related services know, Patreon is an excellent platform for just getting that little bit of support. You know, the aim is if I can get enough money from the Patreon just to cover the rental costs every month, then that's a massive weight off the museum's mind, if you know what I mean. It means that I'm not worrying about that. I can actually take a deep breath, and I can actually worry about getting more exhibits, getting special guests over, and all that kind of stuff. In terms of the Patreon, I kept it very simple on the levels. There's the sort of the minimum level, which is I just like to help out. And that's the sort of £3 per month level. It does mean if you're UK based, that if you're a £3 a month patron, you can come into the museum for free at any time that you like. That's no problem at all. It's free entry. I'm also thinking, because every games club that I now go to has a measure of an entry fee per session, whether those that would like to come to the club on whatever night of the week it might be, if they were patrons as well, then that would help. It would be far cheaper than I'm currently paying in Gloucester, for instance, on a Tuesday night, if they became £3 a month patrons. And again, it takes all that business of people having to handle cash on a Wednesday night or whenever it might be. It just helps. You know, £3 a month is such a small amount, especially if you want to play games four times a month, you know, 4 evenings a month. That's very, very cheap. The £10 a month is sort of the main one, really. That's the one where you get the free entry, you get an invite to the Gathering of Chums weekends. And obviously there's one this year in November, but I'm hoping to do it twice, do a spring and an autumn one. I'm kind of sort of, you know, taking a leaf out of other mini convention books there and trying to do twice a year. And I'm also wanting to do a little magazine, an actual paper fanzine at that level as well. You know, several times a year. I'm not committing to a specific schedule because these things can take quite a lot of effort to put together. But the idea behind that is that I'll have articles about games that have come in, maybe an exclusive game design, a little promo for something, you know, little things, little fun things. But the key thing, it would be a physical item that you would receive. And I love the idea of going back to actually getting a little, you know, 24-page fanzine that comes to your post, and you can sort of digest it and enjoy it, and it's a little thing that you have in your hands. And then above that, they're there for the more committed sort of patron, really. So the £25 a month one is all of the other stuff. Plus, I will gather some gifts at the end of that sort of period of you being a patron at that level, and send you a little package, a care package, I'm calling it. So that would be promos, curiosities, games that I've found that maybe I've got duplicates of, just little things to tickle their fancy at that level, and to say thank you for that level of support. And then finally, what I'm hoping for is I'm going to have a sugar daddy come in and offer £50 a month, and basically pander to their vanity and name an actual exhibit in their honour. So, you know, if you'd like the Ben Maddox Cabinet of Joy, then that can be arranged for the appropriate remuneration.
And so where can people go to back this Patreon then?
Well, the Patreon is patreon.com/The Museum of Board Games, all one word. And it's reminded in other places. I've actually rekindled my social media presence through the lens of the museum on Instagram as the Instagram /the Museum of Board Games, and also on Facebook as well. Mainly because those two are linked together now, so I can post on one and it posts on the other automatically, which saves me an amount of admin time. I'm not gone on Twitter with it. Twitter it still terrifies me a bit. I tend to stay off Twitter if I can help it.
Excellent. Well, Tony, thank you so much. I wish you the best of luck with this endeavour, and hopefully in 10 years we're talking about the singular resource for board game history in the UK.
That would be gorgeous, wouldn't it? Thank you, Ben.
If you want to support content like this, you can go to patreon.com/5G4D. Thank you for listening. Stay safe.